husband had one rule about our son's school records, and I never thought to question it until the day a manila envelope arrived addressed to a 7-year-old. It sat on the kitchen counter when I got home from my shift at Mercy General. Thin, official-looking, return address from something called the Vantage Genomics Institute in Bethesda, Maryland. I turned it over in my hands twice before I noticed the label. Master Oliver Hayes. C. O. Mr. Colin Hayes. Our son was 7. He didn't get mail. I set it down and made dinner. I told myself it was probably a school thing, some science program Colin had signed him up for without mentioning it, the way he sometimes signed Oliver up for soccer camp or coding workshops and just forgot to loop me in. Colin was like that, efficient, decisive, a little scattered about communication. I'd learned to live with it. 12 years together, 9 married. You learn which hills aren't worth dying on. But I kept looking at that envelope through dinner. Colin came home at 7, kissed me on the cheek, ruffled Oliver's hair, and I watched him spot the envelope from across the kitchen. Something happened to his face. Not panic. Colin didn't panic. Something more controlled than that. A recalibration. He picked it up, slid it into his jacket pocket, and said, "Junk mail. They'll address anything to anybody." And that was it. Except it wasn't junk mail. Junk mail doesn't come from a genomics institute in Bethesda. I didn't say anything that night. That was my first mistake, or maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe that silence was the thing that saved me, because it gave me time to start paying attention. I'm a registered nurse. I've worked pediatric oncology for 6 years. I know what genetic compatibility testing looks like. I know the language, the forms, the kind of quiet bureaucratic machinery that moves around a sick child's chart. I recognize it the way you recognize a smell from your childhood. Instantly, in the body, before the brain even catches up. I started noticing other things after that. Colin had a folder on his laptop he kept minimized whenever I walked into the room. He'd started taking calls in the garage, which he'd never done before. 3 times in 2 months, he'd mentioned, casually, that Oliver was a remarkably healthy kid. Which was true, but an odd thing to keep saying unprompted. And once, when I was helping Oliver with a bath and his arm looked a little bruised from a fall at recess, Colin had come in and looked at that bruise with an expression I couldn't name. Not concern. Something more like assessment. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this is what 6 years in pediatric oncology does to you. It makes you see disease and danger in places that are ordinary and safe. I told myself Colin loved our son. I knew he loved our son. That part was never in question. But I couldn't explain the envelope. In February, Colin took a 4-day trip to Chicago for a conference. He did that twice a year, sometimes 3 times. It was normal. The morning he left, he kissed Oliver goodbye for a long time, which was not normal. And then he looked at me and said, "You're a good mother, Lee. I want you to know that." And he walked out to his Uber. I stood in the doorway of our house in Raleigh and I thought, that was the sentence of a man who was about to do something he couldn't take back. I waited until Oliver was at school. Then I sat down at Colin's home office desk and I opened his laptop. He hadn't changed the password. We'd share passwords for years. That was the kind of marriage we had. Or the kind I thought we had. Open, unbothered by the need for privacy. I typed it in and it worked. And for a moment I just sat there, because part of me had hoped it wouldn't. The folder wasn't hidden. It was right there in his documents, labeled Research. Inside were subfolders, one with Oliver's name, one with a name I didn't recognize, Nolan, and one labeled simply VGI. I opened Nolan's folder first. There were medical records. A lot of them. A boy, 12 years old, diagnosed 2 years ago with a rare form of aplastic anemia. His bone marrow had essentially stopped producing blood cells. The record showed 2 failed treatment attempts. The most recent note, from a specialist at Johns Hopkins, said that without a matched bone marrow donor, Nolan's prognosis was poor. I read that word 3 times. Poor. Then I opened Oliver's folder. It contained a consent form, signed by Colin, authorizing enrollment in a pediatric bone marrow registry study conducted by Vantage Genomics Institute. The form was dated 14 months ago. Oliver's HLA type had been collected, processed, and submitted. There was a match report at the bottom of the folder, a compatibility score between Oliver and Nolan, 92%. I sat in Colin's office chair, and I stopped breathing for a moment. 92% is not a coincidence. In bone marrow matching, that number is almost unheard of between unrelated individuals. Between siblings, it's common. I opened the subfolder labeled VGI. There were emails. Between Colin and a Dr. Anita Marsh, the director of the institute. The earliest ones were cordial, almost clinical. Questions about the registry, about the timeline for finding a match. Then they shifted. Colin was asking about the next steps if a family member of the potential donor was not cooperative with the process. He was asking about whether a single parent could authorize a pediatric procedure without the other parent's consent, in states where joint custody existed. He was asking how to do this without me knowing. Dr. Marsh's responses were careful, measured. She said that both parents with legal custody would need to consent. She said the Institute's protocol was clear on that. She said she understood his situation was emotionally complex, and that she would connect him with a patient advocate who could help facilitate family conversations. There was one more email, sent 3 weeks ago. Colin had written, "She doesn't know about Nolan. She doesn't know about any of this. I'm trying to figure out how to tell her in a way that she'll understand. But if she won't agree, I need to know what my options are." I closed the laptop. I sat there in his office for a long time, long enough for the light to change through the window, for the refrigerator in the kitchen to cycle on and off twice. I was trying to locate myself inside what I'd just read, trying to find the version of my life that made sense. Nolan, a 12-year-old boy who needed bone marrow, a boy who matched my son at 92%, a boy in Colin's folder. I pulled out my phone and I searched the name. It didn't take long. Colin's sister Renee had 2 kids. I'd met them at Thanksgiving 4 years ago. A daughter who was 9 then, and a boy who would have been about 8, who would be 12 now, Colin's nephew. I did not cry. I am telling you this not because I want credit for it, but because it surprised me. I expected to cry, and instead I felt very clear, the way I sometimes feel in a code blue. The noise drops away and there's just the sequence of things that need to happen next. I recognized the feeling, and I followed it. I called my sister Miriam in Charlotte, and I told her I needed her to come watch Oliver for a few days. I didn't explain. She didn't ask. That's who Miriam is. Then I called a family law attorney named Karen Voss, whose name I had seen on a community board at the hospital. I made an appointment for the following morning. I took screenshots of every document in Colin's laptop folder, emailed them to a new account Colin didn't know about, and then I closed everything the way I'd found it. When Colin got back from Chicago, I didn't say anything. I made dinner. I watched Oliver do homework at the kitchen table. I kissed my husband goodnight in our bed, and I lay there in the dark listening to him breathe. And I thought about Nolan, 12 years old, failing blood counts, a boy I'd met once at Thanksgiving who had Colin's same careful eyes. I thought about what Colin had been trying to do. Not monstrous, exactly. Desperate. The kind of desperation that makes a person think they can manage everyone around them into the right outcome if they're just careful enough, if they control enough variables, if they keep enough things separate long enough. I thought about what it meant that he hadn't told me, that he'd enrolled our son in a genetic registry without my knowledge, that he'd been researching how to proceed without my consent. He hadn't asked me. He hadn't trusted that I might say yes. He decided somewhere along the way that I was a variable he needed to manage rather than a person he was married to. That was the part I kept returning to. Not the secret. The calculation. Karen Voss was a small woman with silver reading glasses and the kind of stillness that comes from having heard everything twice. I laid the screenshots out on her desk, and she looked at them for a long time without speaking. "He enrolled your child in a medical research registry without your knowledge or consent," she said finally. "Yes. And he was researching how to authorize a medical procedure? Bone marrow donation. Without your consent as a co-parent with joint legal custody?" "Yes." She looked at me over her glasses. "Mrs. Hayes, in North Carolina, both parents with joint legal custody must consent to non-emergency medical procedures for a minor child. What your husband did, the enrollment, the testing, the compatibility matching, he did all of that without your knowledge and without your legal consent. I know, I said. That's not a small thing. I know, I said again. She was quiet for a moment. What do you want at the end of this? I'd thought about that all night. What I wanted was complicated, and some of it was contradictory, and I was honest with her about all of it. I said I wanted my son protected. I wanted transparency from that point forward about every medical decision that touched Oliver's life. I wanted Colin to understand what he'd done, and I wanted to know, really know, what I was walking back into if I walked back into my marriage. I also said this. I didn't want Nolan to die. I said that clearly because I needed someone to hear me say it out loud. He was 12 years old and he was Colin's nephew and he was sick. None of that was his fault. Karen nodded and wrote something down. Let's talk about how to proceed. I confronted Colin that weekend. Miriam had Oliver at her place in Charlotte. Karen had advised me not to go in alone and I didn't. She was in the next room, technically, at the kitchen table of a coffee shop 2 blocks from our house where I could reach her in minutes. We'd agreed on that arrangement. I sat down across from my husband at our kitchen table and I put my phone between us with the email thread open and I said, I need you to tell me about Nolan. The color left his face. He didn't deny it. That was something, I supposed. He sat there and he looked at the phone and then he looked at me and he started talking, and once he started he couldn't stop. It came out in pieces, badly assembled. 5 years of secrecy dismantling itself in real time. Renee had called him 3 years ago when Nolan was first diagnosed. There was no match in the National Registry. The disease was progressing. Colin had started researching, reading papers, looking for any angle. He'd found a study on genetic markers that suggested same bloodline relatives of a parent were more likely to produce a high compatibility match. He hadn't thought it would work. He'd enrolled Oliver hoping it wouldn't work, and then the match had come back and he was 92% and Colin didn't know what to do. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. He said he was afraid I'd say no. I might not have, I said. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and something shifted in his face. I know, he said quietly. I think that's what I was most afraid of. I didn't understand that at first, and then I did. He hadn't been afraid I'd refuse. He'd been afraid I'd agree, and then the decision would be shared, and he'd have to carry it with someone instead of alone. Control, masquerading as protection. I told him what Karen had told me. I told him that what he'd done, the enrollment, the testing, the emails asking how to proceed without my consent, constituted a violation of my parental rights and potentially actionable conduct in family court. I told him I had copies of everything. He nodded. He didn't argue. I'm not going to stop you from helping Nolan, I said. But it goes through me. Every step, every appointment, every conversation with a doctor, I am part of it. And Oliver makes no medical decisions for another person until he is old enough to make them for himself. That means if he is ever a candidate to donate, we tell him everything, age appropriately, and we let him grow into that choice. We don't make it for him. Colin was crying by the end of it. I wasn't. We separated for 6 weeks. He stayed with a friend from work. I didn't file for divorce, which surprised some people who knew the situation. And I'm not going to defend that choice here, except to say that it was mine to make, and I made it with full information. During those 6 weeks, I reached out to Renee. That was harder than confronting Colin. I didn't know what to say to a woman whose child was sick, who had watched her brother carry a secret on her behalf for years. We met for coffee and Carrie on a Tuesday. She looked exhausted and grateful and ashamed all at once. She said she'd told Colin not to hide it from me. She said that more than once. I believed her. Nolan had gotten my name from Colin at some point, I don't know exactly when, and he'd looked me up online the way 12-year-olds do. And Renee showed me a note he'd written to give to me if she ever thought the moment was right. It was 4 sentences long. He said he was sorry I'd been left out of something so important. He said he knew it wasn't fair. He said he'd asked his mom if he could write a letter so I could know that he understood the choice wasn't mine to make for me. A 12-year-old. 4 sentences. I cried then, Finally, in Renee's car in the parking lot of a Panera in Cary, North Carolina, I cried. The consent process was long and careful, the way these things should be. Our family law attorney and the hospital ethics board were both involved. Colin and I went to 3 sessions of family therapy before we agreed to any next steps. Oliver's pediatrician referred us to a pediatric hematologist at Duke who specialized in bone marrow procedures, and she spent 2 separate appointments, one with us, one with Oliver alone, in language appropriate for a 7-year-old, explaining what it would mean. Oliver, 7 years old, said, "Is it gonna hurt him if I don't do it?" He meant Nolan. The doctor said that without a match, Nolan would need other treatments that were harder on his body. Oliver thought about that for a minute. Then he said, "I want to help. But I want to meet him first." So we arranged that. They met at a park in Durham on a Saturday in April. Nolan was quieter than I expected, and Oliver was louder, the way little kids always are. All noise and motion. They kicked a soccer ball around for 20 minutes while the adults sat at a picnic table and didn't say much. At one point, Oliver fell down and Nolan helped him up, and Oliver thought that was the funniest thing that had ever happened. The procedure itself happened in June at Duke Children's. Oliver's donation was peripheral blood stem cells, a method that doesn't require general anesthesia, involves injections over a few days beforehand, and then a collection process similar to a blood draw. His doctor had explained all of this to us, twice, and to Oliver in terms he could follow. It was not the surgery from both children scenario that Colin had once apparently been considering in his darker moments of desperation. It was measured and appropriate, and Oliver handled it the way he handles most things, by asking a lot of questions and then deciding it wasn't that big a deal. Nolan's engraftment took 11 weeks. I know because Renee texted me every update. Colin and I were still in couples therapy, still rebuilding something. I won't tell you it was easy or that I'd forgiven everything, because neither of those things was fully true. But I was trying. We were trying. Some days that felt like enough. The text that said Nolan was responding came on a Thursday morning when I was charting between patients at Mercy General. I sat in the break room with my phone, and I read it 3 times, and then I put my head down on the table and I breathed. The Vantage Genomics Institute was referred to the North Carolina Medical Board for the conduct of Dr. Marsh and her staff in facilitating enrollment and testing of a minor without full parental consent. Karen Voss filed the complaint. I don't know exactly what came of it. These processes are slow and opaque, but I know the investigation was opened. Colin took a different job, with less travel. He asked me once what he could do to make it right, and I told him the honest answer. I didn't know yet, and that was something he would have to sit with. He said he understood. I think he did. Oliver started 2nd grade in September. On the first day, he wore a shirt that said, "Future Scientist," because he'd decided, somewhere between June and August, that he wanted to be a doctor. He informed us of this over waffles on a Sunday with the authority of someone who had thought it through completely. He and Nolan text sometimes now, not constantly. They're not close, not the way cousins can be when they grow up together, but they exist to each other. Oliver knows he has a cousin who got sick and got better, and that he was part of how that happened. He carries that in the light, uncomplicated way that children carry things they haven't yet learned to be ashamed of. I don't know if that's a gift or a weight he'll feel differently later. I imagine he'll decide that for himself. What I know is that for 14 months my husband managed a secret that belonged to both of us. He made decisions in my name without my knowledge, told himself it was for the right reasons, and nearly carried it all the way to an operating room. I know that I almost didn't look in that laptop. I know that a manila envelope sat on my counter, and I made dinner and I almost let it go. I'm a nurse. I spent 6 years watching families navigate impossible choices around sick children. I know what desperation looks like. I know what love looks like when it goes sideways. I know the difference between a person who is cruel and a person who is afraid and has run out of better ideas. Colin was afraid. That doesn't make it right. It makes it human. And human is something I know how to work with. Even when I'm furious, even when I'm grieving what I thought I had. We're still married. We're still in therapy. Some weeks are better than others. Oliver is in 2nd grade and wants to be a doctor and has a cousin who texts him memes about soccer. And the sky this October is the particular bright blue that only happens after the leaves start turning. And I drive home from Mercy General some evenings, and I think about that envelope on my counter, and how close I came to just leaving it there. I'm glad I didn't leave it there. I still think about that envelope sometimes, the way it just sat there on the counter, between the fruit bowl and the mail I'd already sorted, addressed to a 7-year-old who had never received mail in his life. I almost left it alone. That's the thing that stays with me. How close I came to just sliding it to the side and moving on with my evening. There's a version of my life where I did exactly that. What I've come to understand, looking back at everything that happened with Colin and Oliver and Nolan, is that the consequences were already in motion long before I opened that laptop. Colin had set something into motion the moment he decided to manage this alone, to treat our son's body as a problem he could solve without me, to treat me as a complication rather than a partner. That's not a moral judgment from the outside. That's just cause and effect, playing out the way it always does. The choices we make in private don't stay private. They find their way into manila envelopes on kitchen counters. What saved me, and I mean this plainly, not dramatically, was that I had spent 6 years learning to read a situation clearly under pressure. The work I did in that hospital, the years of staying steady when everything around me was not, had built something in me that I didn't always know was there. When the color left Colin's face and I recognized what the envelope meant, I didn't fall apart. I made a list. I called Miriam. I called Karen Boss. I moved through the sequence of what needed to happen next. I'm not telling you this to pat myself on the back. I'm telling you because that steadiness didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of showing up and doing hard things and not looking away from what was true. And the honesty it took to sit across from Colin at that kitchen table and say what I actually wanted, including saying out loud that I didn't want Nolan to die, that cost me something. It would have been easier to be only furious. Fury is clean. What I felt was more complicated than that, and saying the complicated thing required something I had to choose deliberately. What Nolan taught me, without meaning to, was that integrity doesn't require a perfect situation. He was 12 years old and sick and had every reason to be angry at the adults who had made his life so complicated, and instead he wrote 4 sentences asking me to understand that he knew the choice wasn't mine to make. That's not something you're born with. That's something a person builds, slowly, out of the daily decision to be decent, even when it's inconvenient. I think about the 3 of them now. Oliver in 2nd grade, Nolan texting him soccer memes, Colin trying to rebuild something worth saving. And I think about what it actually takes to hold a family together after it's been broken. Not sentiment. Not good intentions. The real work, showing up, telling the truth, earning trust, back in small increments that don't feel like enough until suddenly they do. The envelope was just paper. What mattered was what I decided to do after I read it.